This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again for this afternoon panel. We're very excited about it. I hope everyone had a great lunch. I know I did. Now I'm very sleepy, but I fully expect our panelists to wake me back up because they're going to talk about some very interesting and insightful things. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this panel, and then Professor Shelf is going to go ahead and introduce the speakers. Professor Shelf joined the Emory Law faculty in April 2011 as director of the externship program and co-director of the professionalism program after 9 years in practice in Atlanta. As a native of Virginia, she's a graduate of both the college and the law school at the University of Virginia, where she was elected to the Order of the Coif and received the Margaret Hyde Award, which is awarded by the faculty to an outstanding member of the graduating class. While at the law school, she worked with Richard Bonney, director of the Institute for Law, Psychiatry, and Public Policy, and wrote on legal solutions to school violence. She served as an executive editor on the Virginia Law Review and a justice on the William Minor Lyle Moot Court Board. She also holds a Master of Science in Mathematics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Please join me in welcoming Professor Shelf and the panelists of our second panel up here today.
And we're going to do this sort of opposite from the last panel, so I'm actually going to remain seated, and each of our panelists today are going to give a short presentation before we begin our discussion. So mass shootings continue to haunt us, and each incident prompts a discussion of the crazed people who are carrying out these shootings and what can be done to prevent them from committing these acts of violence. But often what makes for good sound bites and popular advocacy does not actually result in sound policy. Particularly when it comes to guns, and particularly in the South, it can be counterproductive, putting people in gun control versus gun rights camps instead of bringing people together to prevent gun violence. Our panelists today are going to talk about on-the-ground experience with and research regarding the relationship between mental illness and gun violence, and what measures could be used to prevent gun violence among those with mental illness, and what we can do to promote sound policies at both the state and local level and the federal level. And I want to, as sort of a spoiler alert and also a bit of a warning, that a lot of what we'll be talking about today will involve prevention of suicide. And suicide often touches, I think we had a discussion among our panelists, is everybody is within 1 or 2 degrees of separation of somebody who has experienced suicide. And so that will be a lot of what we talk about today. I also wanted to mention that we're going to be talking big picture. There's a lot of great research, and you can read the papers of the individuals on this panel and get into the weeds about the statistics and the diagnoses and so forth. We're going to try to stay at a very high level about sort of what research is out there and what kinds of initiatives and policies work. So I'm going to give a bios of our panelists. I'm going to give short bios because their long bios are in the program, but I just want to give you an idea of where they're coming from. So first, all the way down to the left is Annie Dietz. She is managing attorney at the Law Office of the Public Defender in DeKalb County. She is part of the Specialized Behavioral Health Division, where she handles some of the most high-profile criminal cases in Atlanta. She teaches courses at Emory Law in mental health issues in the criminal justice system, as well as a practicum in criminal competency and responsibility. And she is a graduate of Vanderbilt Law School. Dr. Jeff Swanson is professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Duke University School of Medicine. Dr. Swanson's current research is focused on building evidence for policies and laws to prevent firearm-related violence and suicide, and to improve outcomes for adults with serious mental illnesses in the community. Among other roles, Dr. Swanson was a founding member of the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearm Policy, which he, I believe, works with Professor Bonney on, and serves on the consortium's executive steering committee. He holds a PhD in sociology from Yale University. Next, we have Fred Vars. He is the Ira Drayton Pruitt Senior Professor of Law at the University of Alabama, Culver House School of Law. His work on guns and mental health has appeared in top law reviews and peer-reviewed journals. One Boston College Law Review article has inspired bills in 5 states including Washington State, where the idea became law. Professor Vars is a graduate of Princeton University and Yale Law School. And lastly, immediately to my left, Dr. Mark Rosenberg is President Emeritus of the Task Force for Global Health. Rosenberg served as Assistant Surgeon General at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, right up the street, where he led its work in violence prevention and later became the founding director of the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control. Rosenberg is board certified in both psychiatry and internal medicine with training in infectious diseases and public policy. And he is on the faculty at Morehouse Medical School, Emory Medical School, and the Rollins School of Public Health. He earned his undergraduate degree as well as degrees in public policy and medicine at Harvard University. And with that, I'd like for Annie to start with her presentation to give us an overview of what we're talking about here.
Thank you, Professor Schauf, and thank you, Devin, and all the thrower folks for inviting me here to Emory to speak on this topic. This is a subject that is near and dear to my heart. It is kind of the in and outs of every day of my life. This is the population that I work with. And for those of you who are students here at Emory, I teach trial advocacy. I'm going to stand behind this lectern. Okay, so this is not something that y'all should do in trial advocacy, but as you can see, I'm bound here. So I'm kind of losing my street cred by doing that. Just so y'all understand kind of where I come from, my perspective, like Professor Schauf said, I am part of a specialized behavioral health division with the DeKalb County Public Defender's Office. My boss, Claudia Sari, is committed to serving this kind of very uniquely vulnerable population in the criminal justice system. And to that end, we are one of the only public defender's offices in the state of Georgia that have this kind of division. So we have attorneys and social workers whose sole task is to help people with mental health issues, developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, who find themselves in the throes of the criminal justice system. So that's my background. When Devin reached out to me to ask me to come here and speak to y'all, I was thinking about whether or not my cases, the cases that we handle, have a high rate of gun violence. And my thought was that they didn't. My thought was that anecdotally, I could not think of too many cases that involved actual gun violence. So I talked to the social workers and I talked to the other attorney who handles these kind of cases. And we're talking about a population that has severe and persistent mental illness. So we're talking about people who suffer from schizophrenia, from bipolar, schizoaffective disorder, to the extent that it affects their ability to engage in their own defense to resolve their case. So I wanted to look at some statistics from our office to see if what I kind of thought was true was statistically accurate. I know that the public perception, and we've talked about this a little bit, is that when somebody is mentally ill and finds themselves involved with the criminal justice system, that it is these kind of big mass shooting cases. And that's not the folks that I see day in and day out in the criminal justice system. Those are not the folks. The reality is that people who are involved in the criminal justice system, most of those folks who are mentally ill are people that y'all will never hear about. Other than me or the social workers that I deal with, nobody else is probably going to remember their name or their face or their crime. Most of these folks are folks who are charged with what we like to think of as status crimes. They're in jail because they're homeless and they criminally trespassed on some property that maybe they thought they owned, or public indecency for urinating in public, but not really violent crimes. So I reached out first to NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, to see kind of what their position is, because we do some training with them. And their thoughts are that most people with mental illness are more likely to be victims of crime than to be perpetrators of violent crime. Most people with mental illness are, like I said, nonviolent. Only about a third of our adults and half of our kids who suffer from mental illness are getting the treatment that they need. And NAMI cites factors that may increase the likelihood of violence, which is consistent with my experience. Abuse of alcohol or drugs, a past history of violence, untreated psychosis, or being young and male. So we looked at statistics from my office over a 5-year period from 2014 to 2018. And just so you know, those of you who aren't local, DeKalb County is one of the 5 major metro counties in Atlanta, so it's a high volume of cases. Our office handles about 70% of felony cases that come through the DeKalb County Superior Court. So we had a fair number of cases to look at. So over that 5-year period, we handled 32,455 cases. And these are cases that don't involve severe and persistent mental illness. They might involve some element of mental illness, but not to the level that it affects their ability to resolve their case. We tried to narrow down categories of cases. So this is a little difficult because, as you'll hear from some of our presenters later, there's just not a lot of good statistics. We don't measure cases, we don't count cases that involve gun violence, and that's something that we talked about, maybe including some data on that going forward, but it just wasn't available. So we looked at aggravated assault, which is not necessarily gun violence. It's a violent act that could be a gun, it could be a knife, it could also be violence done with your hands, like a strangulation or something like that. So that was about 12% of the caseload. But again, that's not necessarily gun violence. So we looked at armed robberies. Again, that's not a perfect number because an armed robbery could be committed with a knife, with any other kind of weapon. So that doesn't necessarily narrow it down too much more. So that's 5.4% of the cases. And this isn't even including murders or things like that, because we would have had to physically go through 32,000 files to really narrow that number down perfectly. So we looked at possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, and you all heard a lot about that from our first panel. And that number is obviously not perfect because it's not gun violence. All we know is that a gun was present during a crime, or maybe not during a crime, but somebody who'd been convicted of a felony had a gun. And that's 4.1%. The last thing we looked at is possession of a firearm or a knife during commission of a crime. And again, that's not a perfect number. So, if you're looking at gun violence, you would really need to get a detailed statistical analysis of the murders, the armed robberies, the aggravated assaults to see what was going on. But probably it's safe to say that that number is somewhere north of 5%. I think that's safe to say. If we look at the cases that involve severe and persistent mental illness, which are the cases that are handled by me or my counterpart, we had 1,068 cases over that same 5-year period. 19 involved guns in any way. So that's not gun violence, right? But that's the same kind of statistics we were looking at on the other side, so that's the number we used. So that's 19, which is 1.7%. So statistically less than the general cases that we were looking at. And if you really looked at gun violence, you're talking about less than 9 cases. So less than 1% of our total caseload involves gun violence. And again, we're handling the cases for the severe and persistent mentally ill. So kind of what we thought was true ended up being true. And somebody said it earlier today that by the time a gun is in the hands of somebody with severe and persistent mental illness, there have been a lot of things that have gone wrong in that person's life for it to get to that point. And so we can talk about statistics and we can talk about numbers and we can talk about all of that, but these are real people who are dealing with real problems. And these are the people that I've dedicated my career to serving. So I thought it would be most useful to look at one case, to talk about one person, and I think that this case is illustrative of so many problems in our criminal justice system and with our mental health system in general. So this is the story of Michael Brandon Hill, who is a young man that I represented in 2013 and 2014. A lot of you probably don't know his name. And just to preface this, the information I'm about to share with you is all information that was shared with the judge at his sentencing hearing. So this isn't subject to attorney-client privilege. It's all a matter of public record, so I'm not violating his trust by sharing this information with you. Y'all probably don't know the name of Michael Brandon Hill. Some of you may. Some of you, though, may remember on August 20th of 2013 when, here in DeKalb County, there was a school shooting at McNair Early Learning Academy. Does anybody remember that? Show of hands. Right, so it affected a lot of people because there were a lot of kids, obviously, in that school, and a lot of people were very scared that day, and rightfully so. But I wanted to talk about what led up to that day for Michael Brandon Hill. If you have heard of the case, you might have heard of Antoinette Tuff, who was the school bookkeeper, who talked to Michael, showed him some compassion, and he ended up surrendering himself within about 19 minutes of entering the school. He didn't really have any intention of hurting anyone other than himself that day, but she certainly didn't know that. And so it was a heroic story that she intervened and that no one was hurt that day. Some shots were fired in the school, at the floor. Some shots were fired out and over the police, but nobody was hurt. And Michael's intention was to draw the fire of the police to end his own life. She ended up writing a book called Prepared for a Purpose that was made into a TV movie with Toni Braxton called Faith Under Fire. And so she was able to tell her story, which was a compelling story, but so was his. And we've never really had a full opportunity to tell Michael's story and to use it as an example of what happens when we don't serve this population. So I want to tell you a little bit about his life. This is what people thought Michael was like. This is what that was the perception. That's who played him in the movie. This is the kid that I represented. Michael Hill, who had had one of the saddest lives of anybody I know. One of the advantages of having social workers, a social worker named Tanya Brown worked on his case and got releases and was able to create this rich social history. A lot of our clients aren't the best historians, so they were really able to paint a picture of what his life looked like. At the age of 7, we found records showing that he had problems modulating his behavior. He was prescribed Risperdal, which is an antipsychotic, at age 7, and that's unusual even in the population that I serve. And he had borderline IQ. Age 11, he's diagnosed with bipolar. The IQ is not going to change. Difficulty coping with stressors. And his first suicide attempt was at 11 years old. He reports auditory hallucinations. 13 and 14, he's admitted to 2 psychiatric hospitals. Stays in one for 4 months. Diagnosed again with bipolar psychosis, prescribed a host of medications, and he reports abuse in the home at the hands of his mom and her boyfriend. Age 15, he's diagnosed with a host of issues, including PTSD at age 15, has obviously difficulty maintaining meaningful relationships. He has 3 hospitalizations, one for 7 months. 17, again, 3 psychiatric hospitalizations. His mother on Christmas Day of that year was found frozen to death in his brother's backyard, and they suspected that she had some mental health issues as well. Shortly after that, Michael walked into a lake that was 30 degrees and refused to get out in an effort to end his life. At 18, he's in residential treatment. And here's what happens when our folks age out of the juvenile system. There's really no transition in place for them. Attempts to place him were unsuccessful, and he got frustrated, and he signed himself out about 2 years before the incident at McNair Early Learning Academy. So he was on his own with a ton of problems, mental health issues, low IQ, no income, no support systems. And he finds himself kind of staying on people's couches and things like that. So at this point in his lifetime, in his 20 years, what we found from his records, and this is just what we saw in the records, 20 hospitalizations and 8 suicide attempts at the age of 20. And he's on his own with no system of support. So on August 20th of 2013, he finds himself in a friend's house. That friend, unfortunately, had an AK-47 in that house and some ammunition, and Michael wanted to end his own life, and he remembered there was a school nearby, and he remembered that when he was in school, people protected children. So he went to that school with the AK-47 with the idea that he was going to make threats, but not act on them, and draw the fire of the police. Luckily, Antoinette Tuff intervened, nobody was hurt, but Michael still was charged with a lot of felony charges. One of the things that is a problem in representing this population is that if you are competent to stand trial, which is not a very high bar, and if you are also, if you don't have a viable defense of not guilty by reason of insanity, which that defense is so narrowly crafted that it's like trying to thread a sewing needle with a rope. If you don't have one of those defenses available to you, you were talking about going to trial or entering a plea. And Michael entered a plea in 2014. He was sentenced to 40 years to serve 20 years in prison. And he is currently at Central State Prison in general population. And this is actually the social worker who worked on his case. That's Tanya Brown, and that's at sentencing. So that is how somebody who starts off as kind of a young man with a lot of problems ends up being a statistic, a young man with mental health issues in prison. There were a lot of places where we could have intervened as a society where Michael could have used some help. Obviously, he had family problems, and there wasn't really any systems to support his family. Obviously, the schools, teachers, we ask a lot of them. Asking them to be a social worker and a counselor is too much. They need more services, more supportive services in school, counseling, social workers. The hospitals, we don't have enough beds for people who need psychiatric treatment in Georgia. And of course, all of this is a problem with government funding. I teach a class here at Emory, and it's called Mental Health Issues in the Criminal Justice System. And I started it kind of selfishly because I thought, who better to solve these problems than Emory law students? Taught it for 5 years. And the public policy papers that the students write at the end of the semester are always these optimistic, pretty brilliant solutions to a lot of these problems. But the one thing they all require that we don't have is money. And so until we are committed to giving the funds necessary to protect these vulnerable populations, things like people like Michael Hill are going to fall through the cracks and end up in the space between. So, thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Dr. Swanson.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I don't know if you noticed the rather intriguing subtitle that's listed for our panel, but I've been pondering it and wondering whether I should spend the balance of my time talking about statistics or focus instead on realities. But maybe I'll try to see if we can find that space where they overlap. I'd like to share with you some information about an innovative legal tool known as extreme risk protection orders. It's a time-limited, preemptive, civil court-ordered gun removal scheme that's getting a lot of attention and a lot of support from sort of both sides of the political aisle. But before I do that, I thought I would start by talking about a person. Statistics, at some point, they all devolve to stories and people with lives, and sometimes lives cut short and family members left behind, and they ripple through families and communities and generations, and each of them is a tragedy in its own right. Let me introduce you to Mr. T. Mr. T is a 41-year-old man. He lives alone, and he's intermittently employed. He's a client of a county-based public behavioral health department, and he's receiving treatment for all kinds of different diagnoses, including agoraphobia and anxiety and depression, and he's got some paranoid symptoms. He smokes marijuana on a regular basis, and he's got some back pain, and he's been prescribed a prescription narcotic. He's been arrested one time for drunk driving. He's never been involuntarily committed. He seems to have a lot of anger And a lot of it is directed at the mental health people at the clinic where he's seen. And he's not getting what he thinks he needs. And his family, his girlfriend, are concerned. Are you concerned? Are you worried about Mr. T? Well, you know, if you gave his case to members of the general public, they might think, well, he has mental illness. I think he's probably dangerous. But the reality is that if you're a psychiatrist in a public behavioral health clinic, you see a lot of people like this. And there are many people like this, and it might not be that remarkable. Let me just add one little piece of information to this story. Mr. T is a gun guy. He frequents gun shows, and he has a number of firearms, and he owns them legally. Now, are you any more worried about Mr. T? Well, why am I telling you about him? Why do I have his picture? Why do I know his story? Well, you know, his name is Scott Harlan Thorpe, and he's well known in California because he committed a terrible multiple casualty shooting. He walked into the mental health clinic with a handgun and started shooting people. And one of the people that he killed was Laura Wilcox, a young woman who was a college student working there in the clinic. And Laura became the namesake for California's assisted outpatient treatment law, otherwise known as outpatient commitment, involuntary outpatient commitment, where the state civil commitment authority is extended into the community. Someone is mandated to participate in treatment, the civil court order. That was known as Kendra's law. Mr. Thorpe was found incompetent to stand trial. He was committed to a forensic hospital, and he was restored to competency 2 years later and pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to prison. Laura's parents, Nick and Amanda Wilcox, and I've met them, and they're wonderful people, became advocates for two different laws. The first one was, of course, Laura's law that I mentioned, California's outpatient commitment law. The idea being that if we could get people with untreated mental illness who don't know that they need treatment and otherwise might deteriorate to the point where they become dangerous, and if we could use this court order and give a treatment plan to them, that might improve their outcomes and maybe even prevent some acts of violence. And some years later, the Wilcoxes became advocates for the gun violence restraining order, which is one of the pioneering laws, sometimes known as the extreme risk protection order laws in California. It was passed after another mass shooting in Santa Barbara, in Isla Vista, the case of Elliot Rodger, who had actually been identified by police officers and who'd done a social welfare check, and they determined that he didn't meet the criteria to be detained and evaluated under California's 5150 involuntary detention order. So here's some questions to ponder as we go forward. Did mental illness cause the shooting of Laura Wilcox? I mean, is that the master explanation for what happened? Was it psychopathology? If we just do something about that? Was the shooting predictable? You know, I mean, I can tell you this, it certainly is, and you know, you can predict mass shootings, and I can too. All you need is this remarkable device called a retrospectoscope. And if you've got that, it's amazing what you could see through that. But there's also some evidence and some research on a phenomenon called hindsight bias. And so it's not exactly the same if you're thinking about it ahead of time and trying to prevent this. So maybe it wasn't predictable, and there are meta-analyses that look at all of the attempts of psychiatrists to predict who's going to be violent. They're pretty good at ruling out who's not going to be violent. They can tell you that, you know, a woman in her 80s who's never been arrested is not going to commit an act of mayhem, and they're almost always right. But they're a little less able to say who is going to be violent. It's not much better than a coin toss. So if we can't predict these acts, are they preventable? Maybe there are things we can do to prevent them, even if we can't predict them. And if so, what should we do? Should that shooter have been legally prohibited from purchasing or possessing guns? He hadn't been involuntarily committed. He didn't have a felony record that would have prohibited him from guns. He did have a drunk driving conviction. And here's a thought experiment. Would Laura's law have saved Laura? And if you had a choice between Laura's law and a law that gives the police clear legal authority to take somebody's guns away, would that might have saved Laura? So those are things to kind of think about. Big picture very quickly, since the beginning of our century, 1.7 million people within our borders have been injured by firearms, and 500,000 have died. And that's more than the combined American military combat death toll of the 2 world wars in the previous century. 59% of those, almost 2/3, are suicides, people who die by their own hand, and 37% are homicides, and the other 4% are law enforcement actions, unintentional shootings, and gun injuries where we don't know what the intent was. Now, how does mental illness map onto that? Well, there are a lot of answers to that, but one simple way of looking at it, and just by the way, in passing, public mass shootings, as horrible as they are, account for less than 0.2% of the homicides. If we could have prevented all of the mass shootings since the beginning of our century, 500 lives would have been saved. If we could prevent all of the suicides with guns, 300,000 people would be saved. So just to put that in perspective a little bit. So that's sort of a shaded shape on top of the pie chart is people with known mental illness. These are data from the National Violent Death Reporting System and a study that we've done in Florida recently. So it's about 50% of the suicides where that person had a known mental illness, and maybe 3% of homicides. So if we could cure mental illness and remove that as a risk factor, violence would go down by about 3 or 4%, and the rest of it would still be there. It's caused by all of these other complex things, and the risk factors for it tend to be nonspecific. We'd have a much bigger impact with regard to mental illness if we could focus on suicides. The problem with thinking about this intersection, we have these 3 intersecting circles, suicide and interpersonal violence and mental illness, and they're not isomorphic. They overlap, but if you think about what our federal gun prohibiting criteria do that we've inherited from the 1968 Gun Control Act, it's kind of like that dotted yellow circle there. It focused on people with a mental health adjudication like involuntary commitment, or people who are incompetent or found not guilty by reason of insanity or incompetent to stand trial. But you can see the problem, from the diagram, that we have the criteria are both over and under inclusive at the same time. There are lots and lots of people who are prohibited from firearms who are never going to hurt anybody. They're not violent, and they never will be. People who might have one involuntary commitment 25 years ago. And on the other hand, there are lots of people who really are dangerous, who have impulsive, angry behavior, and they have firearms, and they are not prohibited. So that's kind of the problem. We focus on this point of sale, and maybe the criteria that we have aren't so good. Just to illustrate this, these are some data from our study in Florida, and these are 50 gun suicide decedents, people who used a firearm to end their own life. 72% of those individuals were legally eligible to purchase a gun on the day they died. Not that they bought it on that day, but they could have. If you say we need better background checks, you could have a perfect background check system, and they would have passed the background check. Then at the same time, you have 28% who were already legally prohibited from guns by dint of an involuntary commitment record or a felony prohibitor. And they got a gun anyway. That didn't stop them. That's another problem. That's the problem of implementation and enforcement of the laws that we already have. Now, interestingly, over half of that gun-eligible group of people who used a gun and died in suicide had a history of a short-term involuntary hold under the Baker Act in Florida within the last couple of years, where they were brought in, they were detained, they were seen, there was a mental health crisis, the system knew about them, but it didn't progress to a gun disqualifying commitment, and therefore they retained the ability to have guns. That's an interesting policy opportunity, I think, and it's one of the recommendations of the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearms Policy. About half the states say that at least temporarily we should prohibit guns from people who have that involuntary hold. I'm going to focus a little bit on suicide for the remainder of my remarks here. We sometimes think about suicide as if it were, like this block of ice that appears to be floating on the surface of the ocean. It's what we can see. It's what we can count. 44,193 suicide deaths in 2015. But what we know from the epidemiology of suicide and suicidal ideation is it's really much more like this big iceberg here, under the surface, where 9.4 million people seriously consider suicide every year, and over 1 million attempt suicide. Lots of people are hospitalized. And you know what? The large majority of people who attempt suicide survive. 90% survive, more or less, and 10% die. But what I just told you is a little bit of a lie, because that is true with one major exception, and that is people who use a firearm in their attempt to end their life. And if they use a firearm, you take that iceberg and you flip it upside down, because now 90% die and 10% survive, because people point the gun at the brain and they die of a catastrophic brain injury. And so this is a huge public health opportunity as well. Yes, we should do a lot to try to reduce suicidal behavior and the risk factors for that. But if we did nothing but change the distribution of methods that people use to something more survivable than a firearm, a lot of lives would be saved. And most people who attempt suicide and survive don't go on to die from suicide. They die from something else at another age. So risk-based firearm removal laws, risk warrant law, gun violence restraining order, different terms, red flag law. This actually kind of, as a policy matter, hits this sweet spot where there are people who are eligible to buy and possess guns, but they're at high risk, and they have a lot of guns. So, you know, even if you stop them from buying another one at the point of sale, and they have 7 at home, that's not going to necessarily solve that problem. So there were 2 states initially that had these laws, Connecticut and Indiana. Connecticut's was passed in 1999 after a mass shooting in 1998 at the Connecticut State Lottery Office, and then Indiana followed suit. There are common elements. The statutes now vary a little bit, but the basic idea is this is a civil court order. It's a public safety measure. It's not criminalizing. And it's for people who have guns and they're known, there's information around them that people might have that they pose this risk. And the criteria don't say you have to have a mental illness. They're focused on these behavioral indicators of risk. And it gives the police the clear legal authority to search for and take the guns away. There's due process is usually a 2-step process. The first is an ex parte order that has probable cause as the standard. And then within 2 weeks, there's a hearing at which the state has the burden to prove by clear and convincing evidence that this person meets specific criteria. There are 2 police officers who have to agree, fill out this paperwork. It's run through a state's attorney, and a judge issues this order on the front end. And it's time limited, so it isn't forever. There are now 13 states, plus the District of Columbia, that have enacted some version of one of these ERPO laws, Extreme Risk Protection Order laws, and a number of other states are contemplating it and have bills. And what's interesting is some of these states are quite different in terms of their politics and their level of household gun ownership and the strength of their other gun laws. And so they're different states. It actually provides a kind of common swath of real estate where people who might disagree on the larger, politics of gun control can say, well, we don't fundamentally disagree that someone at high risk, demonstrable risk of harming himself or herself or someone else shouldn't have legal access to a gun at that time. And people can agree on that, even if they might disagree on something you call gun control writ large. Our study in Connecticut, and we've also done this comparable study in Indiana, evaluated what happened to the 762 cases in which this law was used. And it took a while for it to be implemented. It wasn't much action during the first 5 years, and then it really ramped up. One striking statistic is that the average number of guns removed in each case is 7 guns per person. So these are people who have a lot of guns. It was almost all male, but the age span was pretty much across the age span, some older people as well, and half the people, we matched them to their mental health records, already had a record in the public behavioral health system of substance abuse or mental health treatment. Very few of them had an arrest leading to conviction, so these were not people who were involved, by and large, with the criminal justice system. Although most of these laws are passed as a result of a public outcry after a mass shooting, and then the legislature responds and says, let's do something. Actually, what they're mostly used for is people with a suicide concern. This could be, we're really worried about granddad. He's bereaved, he's all by himself, he's drinking heavily, he seems depressed, He has 17 guns and he doesn't want to do anything. What can we do? Well, if you live in one of these states, you can call the police, they can look into it, and they can take granddad's guns away for a while if he meets these certain criteria. And most of the people are transported to a hospital emergency department because they're in a mental health crisis, and the police serves the risk warrant, takes the guns away, and then they say, what do we do? Well, let's take this person. And as a result of that, the proportion of people receiving treatment, outpatient mental health treatment, from the year before to the year after this gun removal event doubled from 12% to 29%. So that was an unintended benefit of this, in my view, that this was a kind of a signal or portal into treatment. When we matched these cases to death records, I didn't think we would be able to say anything about suicide because it's a rare event, and the population level suicide rate is about 12 per 100,000. And we only had 762 cases, but we found 21 suicides in this group of people after their guns had been taken away. And that equates to a rate about 40 times the population risk. I think that's important legally and politically because it shows that this law is being applied in a narrow way to people who are at risk. It's tailored to that group, not just willy-nilly. You know, if we think of suicide as that's a needle in a haystack, this law provides a way of identifying a much smaller haystack with lots more needles in it. We were able to determine, because we knew all of the different methods that people had used, and by the way, none of those suicides occurred, none of the gun suicides occurred, there was a small number with guns, during the year when the guns were retained. All of the gun suicides occurred after the guns were given back. The others occurred, during that year with other methods. And because we have good information on the case fatality rate of each of those, we could estimate, simple algebra equation, what was the probable estimate of number of attempts that produced that range, the distribution of suicides. And we calculated that for every 10 to 20 gun removal actions, one life was saved. That's what's in the balance of risk and rights. Now, is that high or is that low? Well, it may depend on where you're standing. If you are someone who really cares more about the Second Amendment right than anything else, you might say that's unacceptable. If you're someone like me and you have 3 gun suicide stories in your own family, you might think of it differently. You might think that's an acceptable balance. People ask me, what's the one thing we should do to stop gun violence? It's not a one-thing problem, and it's not a one-thing solution. It's a puzzle. We need to do more about the social determinants of crime, and get upstream, have healthier communities with fewer kids exposed to trauma who may grow up to be perpetrators. We need to do something about access to mental health treatment and having systems of care that aren't so fragmented and overburdened and under-resourced that work better. We need to do something to have better criteria at the point of sale, as I was mentioning. What about risky people who are not disqualified? There are all these legal issues we've heard about that need to be resolved. There's gun technology. There's an idea of having smart guns and owner recognition technology. A gun would only work in the hands of its rightful owner. Something to do, try to get a handle on the illegal gun market. So many of these crime guns are acquired in secondary transactions that, people are already disqualified from having a gun when they use one in a crime. And, our gun culture, our guns are embedded in our culture, and they're intertwined with the iconography of our social history. We love guns. We have a heck of a lot of them, and we have to think about how we are going to go forward. I think one of the things that public health laws can do is to change social norms over time, like seatbelt laws did. And that's what we need to do with guns. And then this peculiar problem of mass shootings, where we have these angry, alienated, troubled young men who follow this really deviant cultural script. We need to do a lot more than we're doing in terms of research and evidence-based policy in all these areas. It's going to take a long time. But if we did that, we won't see the big headline one day in the New York Times saying that, more emphasis on the social determinants of violence has prevented mayhem on Thursday. But if we really got there and had a less violent society and world to live in, why would that matter? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Swanson. And now we'll hear from Professor Vars.
Okay. All right, well, thank you very much. This has been a great presentation and symposium so far. I hope I don't really mess it up. So I want to talk, bringing together a lot of what Jeff just said, and hopefully building on that and talking about my own initiative to try to prevent specifically gun suicide. This is title, Self-Defense Against Gun Suicide. You'll soon find out why. The basic idea is to empower people with mental illness, but also others, to take a step toward protecting themselves from gun suicide. That's Ulysses tied to the mast, the famous story, binding himself to avoid the call of the sirens, and this is along those lines. Jeff gave some statistics. I'm going to describe them in just a slightly different way. The mass shootings obviously are horrific and get a ton of media attention. Each gun suicide does not get that kind of attention unless it's some celebrity. And a way to kind of quantify the difference, so the worst mass shooting in modern US history, the Las Vegas shooting, had 59 victims. I include the shooter who committed suicide. The gun suicide every day claims 63 victims. So worse than the worst mass shooting in history is happening every day, and none of it is making it into the paper. So that's just one way to kind of quantify just how serious the problem of gun suicide is. So those kind of numbers are staggering. It's over 20,000 gun suicides a year, well over 20,000. So I want to focus on one individual. Cheryl Hanna was a law professor at Vermont, very successful, happy family, 2 wonderful children, but was also dealing with depression. And had actually twice voluntarily admitted herself to psychiatric hospital precisely for suicidal ideation. She did not want to die, and she was doing what she could to prevent that. She came out after the second hospitalization, purchased a gun the next day. The day after that, used it to kill herself. And it was, we've talked a little about the federal standard, the federal prohibitor based on mental health, this distinction between being involuntarily hospitalized, which does disqualify you from gun purchase, becomes illegal under federal law, a voluntary hospitalization, even to a psychiatric unit, does not disqualify you. So it was a legal gun purchase that she made. A couple of facts, she's not alone. Hundreds of people who are not gun owners go to gun shops to purchase guns specifically to attempt suicide. And firearms, as Jeff was mentioning, are far and away the deadliest, popular, commonly used method of attempting suicide. Something like 85% of the time, and 90% it's successful. For the next most popular method, pills, overdose, it's less than 10% effective. So there's some people won't even switch to a different method, but if you can switch someone from using a gun to using pretty much anything else, you usually save their life. And saving their life during that one attempt is almost always saving their life, period. It's a small subset of people who go and attempt over and over until they succeed at suicide. 90% of people who survive an attempt do not go on to die by suicide. That's a common misconception. I think it's something that, along with the myth that if you don't have a gun, you'll find another way. If you don't do it today, you'll do it tomorrow. These are just not true facts about suicide. Suicide is very often impulsive. People have an idea about one particular method that fails or is unavailable, and they did not attempt suicide. So the proposal is to allow individuals like Cheryl Hanna to put their own name into the background check system. She knew she was at risk. She was seeking help, and she, knew she was battling depression, did not want to die by suicide. And one thing she should have been able to do is simply voluntarily, confidentially add her name to the background check system, so she could not go to that gun shop, could not purchase that gun, and make that irrevocable decision. There would be a way under my proposal for people to change their mind. That's a common criticism I've gotten. And the idea would be essentially you just go make a request. I've changed my mind. I want to go hunting with my nephew. I'm feeling fine now, it's 10 years later, I want my name out of the list, I want to be able to go buy a gun. Fine, you can do that. There's just a waiting period. Your name would come out 21 days after you made the request. The idea, again, so much of suicide is impulsive that just having that 21-day delay is going to prevent a lot of suicide. So one question I get as well, this is unlike, this is not gun control. This is self-control. This is voluntary. This is not mandatory. This is not the law enforcement coming and confiscating your guns. This is you saying, I don't want the ability to purchase guns without a waiting period, right? And so you're making your own election. So a response is, well, that's great in theory, but no one will sign up. So I talked to Cheryl Hanna's husband. He thinks she would have signed up. I know from my own experience with bipolar disorder and suicidal ideation, I would sign up. But I didn't want to stop with anecdotes. I did a survey of patients seeking psychiatric care at UAB in Birmingham. 200 of them were surveyed. 46% said that they would sign up. Followed that up with an internet survey using MTurk, 1,000 internet users. We had a sign-up rate, and these are people not selected by having a mental health condition or not, just sort of closer to a general population type of number. And we got about 30% of people saying they would sign up. So that's a huge percentage of people. And again, what they're doing is sort of opting into a waiting period regime, a 21-day delay, right, for any gun purchase from a dealer. So then my question was, to figure out lives saved, you've got to figure out what's the effect of a waiting period. Would the I've told you, I think gun suicide is impulsive, and there's research suggesting that. But what's the real effect of a waiting period? So I looked around. There were not a lot of studies on this. So co-authors and I did our own study on waiting periods and tried to come up with an estimate for how many lives could be saved. And I'm going to put up numbers, and I don't want you to, these are sort of back of the envelope. Let's get a sense of the magnitude, the potential effect. These are not meant to be precise numbers. So this was the number of suicides, and it's even the numbers are out of date a little bit. So 23,000 suicides in states that didn't have waiting periods, a sign-up rate of 31%, and then the waiting period study to fill in the gap. What's the effect for those people? The people who signed up are all going to have a waiting period now. What would be the impact of a waiting period for that subgroup? And this was the sort of one figure out of our paper during the period in which, because some states do have waiting periods. Some states don't, some states used to, some states have gotten rid of them. So you can look at what was the level of suicide, look at the changes when the policy was enacted and abandoned over time. And we did a panel regression and found that during the period in which there was a waiting period, there was significantly lower suicide, between 2 and 5%, and statistically significant. So nationwide, if every state that does not currently have a waiting period adopted my proposal, we would save hundreds of lives. And that's the bottom line. Again, the exact numbers are the roughest of estimates. But the potential there is for hundreds of lives per year. How much would it cost, right? If you're throwing out a policy, you got to say what I've established. Perhaps there are some benefits. We could save some lives. The federal background check system is already there. It's already set up. It's operational. It's funded. To my knowledge, it did not go down during the government shutdown. The money is still there. And all you really need to implement my proposal is an easy way for people to put their name into a currently existing system. So we just need a new mechanism for putting names in and taking names out. Could be a website, could be a mail-in form, could be some other. Again, you want to make it easy for people. You obviously have to have a system that's going to verify their identity, right? The idea is people are protecting themselves. You don't want someone else to sign up, someone else fraudulently. It's got to be an individual decision. But all you need is that new mechanism to get new names in and out of an existing system. So should not be very expensive. Obviously, you've got to couple it with some sort of campaign to inform the public of this possibility. I think healthcare providers would be an obvious set of people who might have an interest in presenting this as an option to patients who are dealing with suicidal thoughts, and hopefully the word could get out that way. Another feature of the proposal, and this was true in I think every state, is to allow people when they sign up to list names of people to be notified should they make a request to have their name removed. And the idea would be, look, I don't trust myself, and I think even in the future, I may not want to trust myself without someone I trust kind of looking over my shoulder. So you list your wife, your family member, your husband, your boyfriend, who has an opportunity when that request comes in during those 21 days to check in and say, how are you feeling, right? Are you going hunting, or do we need to talk about what's going on, right? So there's a chance for an intervention. You could even list your healthcare provider, right, if you want your psychiatrist to know that you're now making a request to get a gun. Okay. So bills have been introduced I think in the intro, I think we're up to about 7 or 8 states, expected bills in Illinois, Louisiana. There's a federal version. I don't know whenever, if that will ever be introduced. Washington State actually passed a version of the bill, which just went into effect in January. So it's a continuing kind of ongoing project. This is a bunch of information that I have a website, Facebook, email, shamelessly promoting the policy as much as possible. So if you're interested, let me know. And I wasn't able to get my timer. How am I doing for time? Should I just wrap it up? Yeah. Okay. Well, that was, yeah. So then I am done. Thank you.
And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Mark Rosenberg.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming to talk about and hear about this topic. And being last on this panel after lunch, I am honored that at least half of you are still awake. I appreciate that. I wanted to talk about our questions that you heard posed to you today, this morning by the keynote speakers, this afternoon by the extraordinary panel we have here. The questions are so important. They're questions of life and death. And that's what I want to talk to you about, these questions. I'm going to start with a poem. It's a poem called The Troubles. It says, think of the children behind the coffins, look sorrow in the face, all those 30 years, the years of disgrace. It's so short and so good, I'll read it again. He says, think of the children behind the coffins, look sorrow in the face, all those 30 years, the years of disgrace. This is a poem written by Michael Longley, the former poet laureate of Ireland, and he was talking about the Troubles in Northern Ireland when, over a 30-year period, 3,600 people were killed. In the United States, we've had not 3,600 gun deaths, but we've had 38,000 gun deaths a year and more than 500,000 gun deaths in the 20 years since our federal government stopped looking for a way to solve this problem. Talk about troubles, we have them in spades. And most of these deaths could have been prevented using research to find interventions that can both reduce gun violence and protect the rights of law-abiding gun holders. We can find things that solve both objectives simultaneously. It's not either or. And this science has done extraordinary things in our lifetime. It was a man from Atlanta, Dr. Bill Foege, who was the director of CDC, who helped eradicate smallpox. This was a disease that in the previous century, the 20th century, killed more than 300 million people. And now using science, it's eradicated. It's gone from the face of the earth. Polio, that used to cripple millions and millions, has now been reduced to a handful of cases around the world. Heart disease, that used to be so widespread, has been so greatly reduced that cardiologists are going out of business. Science has done some pretty amazing things here, but in this area of gun violence, we're not using science. We're hearing the questions, and we're not searching for the answers. How did we get to this point? How did we get to this horrible situation of our troubles on our hand? In 1983, the same Bill Foege who helped eradicate smallpox said, we're going to start looking at violence as a public health problem. This was a few blocks down the street at CDC, right next to Emory University. And he said, we're going to apply a public health perspective. What do we mean by a public health perspective? Very, very simple. It's based on science. It's focused on prevention, as opposed to most criminal justice interventions that happen after the violence is committed and you find the perpetrators and put them in jail. Public health says we're going to try and prevent this from happening in the first place. We're going upstream to see who's pushing all these bodies into the river, not just do CPR on all the bodies that we see floating down. So it's based on science, it's focused on prevention, and it's collaborative by necessity. Public health is not a profession. It's made up of people working in psychology and social work, in criminal justice, law, anthropology, sociology, medicine, nursing, housing, education. It's got to be collaborative. It's not one thing. So this is what defines a public health approach. And we had looked at what research did in motor vehicle injuries. In the 1960s, there was a tremendous epidemic of young people dying on the highways. They were being killed in very large numbers, and our government said, we're not going to put up with this. Good government. And they started the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and they said, we're going to put money into research for this. They put in $200 million a year, and as a result of that research, we've accomplished tremendous things. Cars, on the basis of that research, were totally redesigned. I learned to drive with my grandfather in this little red Ford Falcon, and it had a steering column that was solid steel. And it was very common to see pictures of people who had been in front-end collisions who'd been impaled on the steering column, a spear through their chest, or a sharp middle of the steering wheel that would crush your chest. And they had engine blocks that were like anvils. In a front-end collision, that engine block would come into the passenger compartment and crush you. As a result of the research, they totally redesigned cars. The steering column collapses. The engine block crushes like an accordion to protect you rather than to flatten you. There's side impact protection, rollover protection, front end impact protection, seat belts, front airbags, side airbags, head airbags, knee airbags. You are so much safer in cars now. They were totally redesigned by that research. And roads were redesigned by that research. In front of Emory University, there's a traffic circle. And road engineers learned that red lights kill people. They're death traps. You should never stand for a red light being put up in your community. How do they kill people? The only crashes that are fatal are high-speed crashes. And what happens when the light turns yellow? People speed up. It transforms the slow impact fender bender from a minor collision to a fatality when you have red lights. In Sweden, they took out all the red lights at the intersections, every one, and the death rate at intersections went down by 90%. An amazing intervention. But this research on motor vehicles saved lives. They redesigned cars, they redesigned the roadway, they redesigned drivers, they got intoxicated drivers off the roads. And as a result, the death rate went way, way down, and we've saved more than 600,000 lives. What happens when you try to go without research, when you don't have the answers? No, there's a very illustrative example. In the 1960s, a pharmaceutical manufacturer announced that they had a miracle drug. This was a miracle drug for pregnant women. If you've ever been pregnant or lived with someone who has been pregnant, you know that there are two really awful things. One is insomnia, you can't sleep, and the other is morning sickness, you're sick to your stomach. They had the miracle pill that would stop both. They were so effective in convincing people to use this pill that Germany made this pill available over the counter. That same drug company came to the United States and said, we'd like to sell this in the United States. You want to sell this? What does it do? It's a miracle drug, a miracle. And a brave young woman physician, Dr. Kelsey at the FDA, said, well, show me the data. Show me that it's safe and show me that it's effective, and then we'll approve it. Well, they left and they came back and they said, really, this is a really important drug. I think you should approve it. She said, you have the data? They said, no. She said, come back later when you have the data and can show it's safe and effective. They left and they came back 6 times, and 6 times she said, no, not without the data to show it's safe and effective. By that time, there had been an epidemic of young people being born without arms, without legs. Mass abortions, spontaneous abortions, other congenital defects. The drug was thalidomide. That's what happens when you approve things without knowing whether it's safe or effective. And I would argue that our legislators, our lawmakers right now are being asked to approve things without knowing if they're safe and effective. Does arming teachers save lives? Or does it take more lives? We don't know. Putting armed guards in school, does that save lives or take lives? We don't know. Does banning semi-automatic rifles prevent mass shootings? We don't know. But we're asking policymakers to pass things and approve things without knowing whether they're safe and effective. CDC developed something that we call the public health approach. We said there's 4 questions that you have to ask. What's the problem? Who gets killed? Who kills themselves? Where, when, how does it happen? With what kind of weapons? Under what circumstances? What's the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim? Are these things going down or are they getting worse? Are we having more? But what's the problem? The second question is, what are the causes? What's the role of mental illness? What's the role of easy access to guns? What's the role of alcohol? What's the role of crime? What's the role of domestic violence? But what are the causes? What are the risk factors? The third question is, what works? Once you find an intervention that you think might work, you have to test it. And I would say there's no other way to know if it works. You don't know. You can't do these thought experiments in your mind. It's particularly complicated because what works means what works to reduce gun violence, and because we live in the United States and have a constitution, it means what also works to protect the rights of law-abiding gun owners. There's no way you can solve this in your mind. You have to do the experiment. You have to test it. You have to try it and see what works. And then finally, how do you implement things? How do you put things into practice? How do you translate an intervention that works into policy and legislation? How do you scale it up from one small place to a district, a county, a state, or the country? But this is what we call the public health approach, asking and answering these 4 questions. Well, we started to ask and answer these questions down the street at CDC, and the first research we funded showed that if you have a gun in your home, it asked the question, does having the gun in your home protect you? Because the NRA had said, if you're a man, and later they said, if you're a woman who cares enough about your family to protect them, you'll have a gun in the home. Well, this research asked the question, does having a gun in your home make you safer? And the answer was, not only does it not make you safer, but it increases the risk that someone in your home will die from homicide with a gun by 200%. That's a 3-fold increase. Is 200% a big increase in risk? Well, the FDA, if you ask them to approve a new drug, and the side effects of the new drug are 20% more than the old drug, it won't get approved. 20% is too big a risk for them to take. 200%? 10 times that, and the risk of suicide to someone in your home is 5 times, goes up fivefold. The NRA didn't like that. We got attacked. People wanted to stop our research. And this man, a conservative, born-again, Christian, lifetime NRA member, Republican, decided he would be the point person for the NRA and tried to stop us. And when we had a hearing for our research in Washington, he came out and attacked us mercilessly. It was really, really bad. The Dickey Amendment was passed. It said none of these funds that are going to CDC's Injury Center should be used for gun control, advocacy, or promotion. We weren't doing promotion. We weren't lobbying. We weren't allowed to lobby for things. We were doing research. But this was a shot across the bow to scare people away from doing this. It was really, really bad. I think it would be fair to say he hated me and I hated him. My bosses said, Rosenberg, don't you ever talk to that congressman. You'll just make things worse. Never, ever, ever. It was really bad. And as a result of the Dickey Amendment and taking away our appropriations, gun research fell at CDC by more than 90%. I want to show you what happened next after that. If you bear with me to watch this.
It sometimes seems like America can't do much about gun violence. Sorry, did I say sometimes? I meant always. And did I say very much? I meant a single thing. But why? Jordan Klepper has more.
The Center for Disease Control helps keep America safe with vital research into everything from polio to Ebola to car accidents and food safety. And for a while, they also studied gun violence. But that ended 20 years ago with the congressional bill known as the Dickey Amendment.
Congress prohibits us even studying through the Center for Disease Control ways in which we could reduce gun violence.
To find out why scientists need to keep their nerd hands off our guns, I sat down with columnist and Pixar animation character Jazz Shaw.
They are pushing an agenda to come up with documentation to support gun control legislation in Congress.
Right, the famously agenda-driven CDC, with the agenda of eradicating diseases and
gun control.
Right.
Exactly. Scientists use numbers and facts and something called peer-reviewed studies to do one thing: destroy the Second Amendment. Even ex-CDC Director Mark Rosenberg can't deny that fact.
The CDC does have some biases, but those biases are in favor of preserving life, of promoting well-being.
Yeah, liberal causes.
CDC has the largest collection of professionals working on violence prevention, and it had the potential of being what would get us out of the problem of gun violence.
Fortunately, that's not going to happen, because if you remember, former Arkansas Congressman Jay Dickey pulled a total Dickey move and helped pass the Dickey Amendment.
That Jay Dickey guy, that congressman, said, we're going to take that money away from CDC, and we're going to put language that's going to govern how you spend all of your money. I thought of him as this arch enemy, this devil incarnate.
Ooh, that guy sounds like a freedom-loving badass.
To bring about gun control advocacy.
So where is he now? With a gun, of course. This guy is the kind of Second Amendment defender who could really slap some sense into Mark Rosenberg. Hey!
Are you Jay Dickey?
Yeah, what's it to you?
Yeah, come with me.
Here come the fireworks.
Mark, you're in deep I brought the guy. Jay Dickey.
Jay.
Hi, Mark.
Oh, I thought I was gonna see Old Man Fight Club.
What the is going on? Jay, tell him how you feel about the CDC doing research about gun violence.
I think the CDC should do the gun research that relates to gun violence.
You're the guy. It's your bill.
I feel different now than I did before. Science has answers, and research is the way to free it. That's the way I see it.
I learned that we could find ways to prevent gun violence and to protect gun rights at the same time.
Bull.
How are these two even sitting in the same room together?
Here you had a born-again Christian, conservative NRA spokesperson.
Republican.
Republican. And here you had this wise-ass liberal Northeast Jewish kid.
Overeducated.
You guys are funny. You're like from totally different perspectives, but put together like that TV show.
The Odd Couple.
No. Two broke girls? Because there's two of you, and it's just like that show. Is that the show?
Well, but you know,
Quantico. You guys are like Quantico.
I haven't seen that.
Perfect Strangers. Is it Perfect Strangers?
My wife knows.
Modern Family? What I'm saying, you guys are like a TV show.
But it's more important than that.
You might say, Jason, he was born again for Jay
Why
to
don't you call him
change his
Jordan?
Jordan.
There's a river in Israel named the Jordan River.
I feel like any second you guys are gonna start braiding each other's hair. They were the most adorable old guys on the planet who are pushing for federal research into gun violence prevention. And I was starting to get on board.
This nation has poured hundreds of millions of dollars into research to design safer cars and safer roads. Why don't we pour some money into gun violence prevention research? And maybe we can also save lives and protect gun rights.
They're right. But does Jazz Shaw, the world's worst fake typer, agree? The CDC studied automobile accidents, made America safer. Shouldn't we take some of that energy and put it on other things that kill people, like gun deaths?
They did good work, and they probably saved a lot of lives.
But
Well, we studied cars. How many people die in car accidents?
if we can't get rid of the entire problem, why try?
A lot of people still die in car accidents.
But a lot less because we've made progress because we studied it.
Right.
Right.
And we made improvements
Great.
to the safety equipment.
That sounds great.
How are you going to improve the gun?
You're gonna study it, you Sorry, lost my cool. Didn't handle that as well as Jay and Mark probably would have. The point is, there's only one way we're going to reach a middle ground and make some progress reducing gun violence in this country.
We need to stop the screamers, but shoot down the ideas that are bad.
That's a great idea. It was time to set our sights on ignorance. To take aim at all the dumb arguments like science has an anti-gun bias or we should take away all guns immediately. Because that's never gonna happen. We can move towards a better America by literally pulling the trigger. And blowing these bad ideas out of the sky. Miss? Damn it. It helps the metaphor if we can actually hit them. Progress could take a while.
We were able to come together. We started on opposite sides of this. We came to talk to each other despite the forbiddance of my bosses at CDC. And in talking together, we came to trust each other. We came to know each other. We came to learn from each other. I think Jay learned about the value of science, and I learned about the importance of letting people know that you can protect gun rights, and that's got to be part of your research objective. You have to aim to find things to protect gun rights and to reduce gun violence. And unlike the NRA strategy, the NRA told people it's either or. Either you do the research or you keep your guns. You can't do both. You can do both. And there are strategies that you've heard about today that will take guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them, but not do anything to reduce the rights of the people who should. We can find these answers. We've got to start the research up again. It is crazy for both sides to be fighting each other, not talking to each other, but vilifying each other and ignoring the problem. We all pay the costs, and the costs are extraordinary now that mass shootings occur more than every week. More than every week. NRA members don't want their children massacred at school or at outdoor concerts or in movie theaters. Gun control people don't want their kids shot. They don't want veterans to commit suicide or law professors impulsively to shoot themselves. People want the same ultimate goal, and we can get there, but we've got to start asking and answering these questions. Thanks.
Thank you. That was great presentation, and I really enjoyed the Comedy Central piece. But we also had great presentations from all of our panelists. Rather than engage in discussion among the panelists, I want to make sure, because we only have about 10 minutes left, I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So if somebody has a question, why don't you come up to the microphone? And while I'm waiting for, oh, well, do we have someone right there? Are you going to ask a question? Okay. Oh, okay. Well, while we're waiting for people to come up and ask questions, I will ask this. I think we are probably despairing a little bit about the likelihood that the federal government will be able to pass legislation that would be aimed at preventing gun violence. What is it that can be done at the state level to help fill the gaps in the current laws that regulate access to guns, that regulate the sale of guns? What do you think we could do at the state level to reduce gun violence?
One thing you can do is this research goes on at the state levels. California started a violence prevention research center 2 years ago, and Jay and I both testified in favor of that legislation. Garen Wintemute, a renowned gun researcher at UC Davis, is doing some extraordinary work in that area. Other states can do the same. There is a lot of research going on within states in academic settings, foundations, nonprofit organizations. It's going on, but it's a trickle. It's a trickle. That research on cars and car deaths was started at $200 million a year. A year. The cost of gun violence deaths is probably $240 billion a year if you value a human life. But President Obama said, let's start this at $10 million. It's a trickle. The research you heard about today is really good. There's a lot more that can be done at the state level as well as policy.
I was just going to say on a policy level, I mean, the federal government sets the floor, and as we heard this morning, the Second Amendment has not been interpreted to strike down very much state legislation. So at this moment, states can do almost anything to enact policies. I mean, yes, it'd be great if they could get the data and have a policy that's well-reasoned in advance, but in the meantime, they can move forward.
I'm part of a group called the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearms Policy, and it includes a number of researchers as well as people in various practice and policy positions and people trained in the law. And we've produced a report that I commend to you that has a series of recommendations for what state legislatures could do, and then there's a report for proposed federal reforms. And at the state level, it's really focused mostly on the idea of having some better criteria for defining who should not have a gun. I mean, we can't broadly limit legal access to guns. We have to have things that will protect the rights of lawful gun owners, but we could have a better correlation between the prohibiting criteria and actual risk. Those would be things such as states could prevent any violent misdemeanors from, they have a history of violence, and in some states, California is one that does that, and that could reduce violence. People who are subject to a temporary domestic violence restraining order, that's a high-risk time. People who have multiple DUIs, we know a lot about the connection between problematic alcohol abuse and interpersonal violence and suicide. Maybe people with multiple convictions involving drugs. That only focuses on the point of sale issue, but then the extreme risk protection order is a law that I've talked about, and one I didn't mention is the idea of people who have a mental health crisis and are identified and have a short-term involuntary hold, but don't get a gun disqualifying commitment. About half the states actually do look at that as an opportunity to at least temporarily prohibit guns from people. So those are some ideas at the state level and are being enacted, and there are differences that we can see from evidence that's emerging.
And I think on a very basic level, we as a society need to invest more time and more money in our community mental health services, both in our schools and then in our communities as people age out of the juvenile system and are away from the schools. You know, until we work on promoting the idea of mental wellness from an early age and removing the stigma that's associated with mental illness and really, increase a real dialogue about those issues and promoting health in our children. And then protecting them as they grow and protecting them as they age into adult, and providing them with necessary mental health treatment in the community, and invest in housing for people with serious mental health issues. Those kind of things would make a huge difference and reduce both suicide and homicide.
All right, we have a question.
Sure. Thank you so much for a really engaging discussion. My question is specifically for Professor Vars, or really anyone else. So part of your proposal, I think, would require people to be honest about the state of their mental health. And that can be really difficult for some people, whether because of their mental health disorder itself or because of the stigma surrounding that. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about what people can do to reduce that stigma, and what ideas you would have to enable and empower people to take that step to acknowledge their mental health state and to take that kind of step to self-enroll.
Great. No, that's a terrific question. That we have not talked much about stigma, but it's hugely important, particularly if you're going to have a voluntary program. My proposal would allow people to confidentially and without any attestation as to the state of their mental health. Their mental health would be presumed, their competency would be presumed. They go onto a website, don't have to interact with a human being, and therefore avoid any and all stigma. That's the short, kind of easy answer. But the more important question about reducing stigma, I mean, I just think there's so much. I think the media has such a big role. I think more and more celebrities acknowledging diagnoses. I think there's progress being made on stigma, but there is a very long way to go.
I think another part of Fred's approach is getting people to understand that when they're suicidal, or even before they become suicidal, it doesn't mean you're hopeless. It doesn't mean you can't control your own future. And giving these people the sense that you can think ahead and have some responsibility for saving your own life, that's giving them hope. It's the same thing, I think, on a national scale. The worst thing that we can do is to feel fatalistic about this problem of gun violence. You know, fatalism is feeling that you can't do anything to improve your own future. And we can, and yes, there's 400 million guns, okay. And yes, the gun control people right now aren't talking to the gun rights people right now, okay. And the federal government's not doing anything about this right now, but we can fix these things. We can get out of it. It's very much giving hope to the individual to think ahead. It's the same kind of hope and avoiding fatalism that we need as a country.
Thanks. We have another question, and I think this may be our last question.
Hello, my name is George Brewster. I had a question for particularly Dr. Rosenberg. You mentioned earlier the Dickey Amendment. I was wondering what types of research is the CDC allowed to do at the moment?
The Dickey Amendment does not prohibit any types of research. It's been misinterpreted. And the Democrats put forward a bill last year to get rid of the Dickey Amendment. That is absolutely the wrong thing. The Dickey Amendment doesn't prohibit any type of gun violence prevention research at CDC. What they need at CDC is money, funding, and appropriations. That will let them do the research, but the Dickey Amendment doesn't prohibit it. In fact, if we're going to get out of this mess, it's because the Republicans and Democrats, the gun rights and the gun control people, will come together in a coalition. It has to be a bipartisan coalition. We're not going to get out of this in a year or 2 or 5 or 10. It's a long-term project, and we need to work together. The Dickey Amendment actually says none of these funds that go to CDC can be used to promote or advocate gun control. If a Republican congressman wants to vote for appropriations for research, the Dickey Amendment gives him cover because he can say, I'm not putting any money into gun control. In fact, I'm guaranteed that this money will only be used for research. So the Dickey Amendment doesn't stop CDC from doing this research. It's really that when it was first passed, it made it a hassle to do research in this field, because you could get a congressional letter of inquiry that would take you weeks to answer to show that you're not doing gun control legislation, even if you weren't. But now the Dickey Amendment, where it was an obstacle, can now be a bridge to the future research that we need.
I'll just add one comment to that. I mean, Mark is absolutely right. The letter of the Dickey Amendment should never have prevented legitimate public health research on the causes and consequences of gun violence. In fact, it had, I think, a chilling effect because how it was perceived and how it was defined, the definition of the situation, and people act on the basis of what they believe to be true. And it wasn't just the CDC, it had a chilling effect on funding by other federal agencies. And we actually received a grant to study the impact of mental health background checks and reporting to the NICS, funded by a federal agency, but the program people amended the title of it so that the title read Testing Competing Theories of Violence. It did not mention guns in the title or in the abstract, to try to fly under the radar, not to invite all this potential extra scrutiny about a controversial study. I mean, that's really sad that you can't even admit on the face of it that we are studying firearm-related injury and mortality. So there is this kind of extra effect that it had, apart from what the actual language of it should have or should not have prevented.
In addition to the Dickey Amendment, Congress took away all the funding
Right.
that we were using for that research. And then a few years later, the person most closely identified with pushing this gun violence prevention research was fired from CDC. That was me. I have something in common with Mr. Thrower, who was fired from the IRS. Firing can be a good thing sometimes, though it takes a long time to realize it. But these 3 shots across the bow really cooled the research. And recently, the Rand Corporation put out a report saying of all the types of gun violence, with all the types of people who commit it, if you make a matrix, we don't have enough information because of the Dickey Amendment and taking away the money. We don't have enough information to say whether there's strong evidence for a single intervention or type to say that it works. We are going blind into this future. It's a deadly future, but the Dickey Amendment, taking away the money, really had a chilling effect. But it can be restored, and it's time to start again. The troubles should be over.
Great. And on that note, we will close out this panel. This has been wonderful. Thank you for coming.